So, hello and welcome to anyone watching this online. My name is Astrid Korporaal and I'm here with Suzanne Dhaliwal. This conversation is part of a series of an emergency response program at Almanac Projects, which is entitled Almanacare, and it's supported by Arts Council England. And together with curators Joanna Harrison, Bianca Stopani, Guido Sant'Andrea, and Iside Pandolfo, and many invited contributors, we are attempting to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, the ongoing disregard of QT by POC lives, and the growing urgency for environmental justice. And all these issues have pointed us to question and critically rethink the role of our lives and our labor. We acknowledge the multifaceted impacts of white privilege that we have inherited as curators, and we are committed to creating positive social change in the long term through a situated practice and poetics of listening, learning, unlearning, and learning again in solidarity. I am really grateful for this opportunity to talk to Suzanne Dhaliwal, whose work I've been following for quite some time and who I am a bit of a fangirl of. She is a climate justice creative, campaigner, researcher, and lecturer in environmental justice, and trainer in creative strategies for decolonization. She co-founded the UK tar sands network, which challenged BP and Shell investments in the Canadian tar sands in solidarity with indigenous communities, and spurred the internationalization of the fossil fuel divestment movement. She has led numerous campaigns and artistic interventions to challenge fossil fuel investments in the Arctic and Nigeria that violate the rights of indigenous peoples and of those seeking justice in the wake of the BP Gulf of Mexico disaster. She also has a Master of Arts in Social Sculpture from Oxford, where she has started to develop creative strategies to address the lack of representation and ongoing white supremacy in the UK climate justice movement, and I think also beyond the UK. Thank you so much for joining me, Suzanne. So I have a few questions prepared for our conversation, and I will just kind of jump in. So many people I know want to do something for the environment. Many artists want to do something to contribute. They know that just consumer awareness is not enough, just buying different products is not enough. But I think many people can feel overwhelmed and perhaps don't know where to start. There's a lot of negativity in the media as well. And it's really inspirational to see how you combine the skills of your different experiences with NGOs, activist groups, and anarchists and eco-communities in your work, as well as your creative practice and your position as both colonizer and colonized. What is a step that you could recommend for people who want to get involved and want to find out where their skills might be useful?
Yeah, I think one of the first things to do is, and I often call this climate literacy, is understanding the situation that we're in a context of colonial history. So, you know, as much as the urgency can make us feel like we want to act now and we do need to act, it's also important to step back and to see that this is, you know, a 500-year journey of decolonization, of land grabs, of appropriation, of all of those violences. And so it's important to stop and to take stock and not to bombard ourselves with feeling bad or feeling guilty, but to understand where we stand in that work. And then also that means doing some research, finding out who are the people who have been holding this work for a long time. And they're not always necessarily on Instagram. Sometimes we have to dig a little bit deeper. And we just had the 25-year anniversary of the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Ogoni Nine. And I consider the work around understanding that history, that connecting to environmental ancestors, a really important part to spiritually ground yourself, but also to understand that we're coming to something that has deep strategies. The context I raised there around the Ogoni Nine and the Ogoni Bill of Rights deeply shows how the fight for indigenous rights is connected to land rights, is connected to the resistance against shell. So as much as possible, doing that, and doing that for your own lineage as well. I recently did that for myself and learned a lot about the Bishnoi indigenous communities in northern India and the struggle they went through to protect trees. And I was like, oh, this is why I'm like this. You know, that they would, yeah, so that's a really important part of it. And the strange thing is the coronavirus, in a way, gives us that opportunity to do that work, because often we can't just go and act in many of the ways that we were perpetuating. So taking that time to do that. And then what you said about our talents, something that we did a lot in our social sculpture practice was mapping, and mapping the institutions that you interact with, the shopkeepers or the people in your community. I know that's limited now, but we still have a community. Mapping your finances, where is your money, where is your pensions? And we talk about reparations, but they're not necessarily something in the future, they're now. So that can even mean like moving your resources to some of the people that you understand doing that work. I think it's really, as well as it being a massive thing, grounding it in your biography, grounding it in your story is a way to really sustain that work, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think the practice of mapping sounds like a really helpful tool as well. One of the things I hadn't thought about was, for example, pensions. I think we've been becoming aware of our banks maybe being connected to shady investments, but pension funds as well can be something to look into. It's on my list of mapping to do.
And even it's not very sexy or exciting, but insurance, a lot of the work I've been doing is around insurance. And it can be that you look into, what does your insurer provide, coal and tar sands, and there's some campaigns around getting your insurers out of there. But also just, it's your entry point, like seeing where you interface with capitalism, because it can seem, again, like really amorphous, really faceless, but seeing your interface with that as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that a lot of us maybe feel disconnected from intergenerational knowledge about these struggles. And you've spoken about the long history of Indigenous environmental activism. And I think there's this view in Europe that we don't have Indigenous communities, which I'm not sure really is correct. And also we seem to have forgotten that we in Europe also had these huge forests that have been lost, and we're sort of been already taken over by monoculture. And yeah, I wondered if you could say a bit more about who taught you these lessons of heritage, and if there's something we could be teaching more in schools or in universities about this.
Yeah, I think I learned a lot of this because of being displaced, of being, you know, not British enough to be British, not Punjabi enough, not straight enough to be in that space. And so I was really in this in-between space. And when I was 11, my parents actually moved to Canada because of Margaret Thatcher. And when I was in Canada, I really started to, you know, connect with the land, because I was in the middle of, you know, the suburbs. There wasn't much to do. And when I was studying philosophy, I started to learn more about traditional knowledge and Indigenous knowledge in Toronto, and started going to ceremony. Firstly, for my brother. My brother's autistic, and my family was seeking medicines for him, understanding it was before autism, before diagnoses or anything. So I would literally go to ceremony, asking for support for him, learning all of the integrative medicines under the sun. And then when I was doing ceremony on the land in a sweat lodge, I remember just feeling this deep sense that there was something wrong with the land, and I didn't know what it was, but I had to support it. And that was in 2006. And then that was combined with research into looking into peak oil, and understanding the implications of peak oil, and also the relationship between extractivism and indigenous rights. So for me, when I talk about being interdisciplinary, it's been on multiple of those levels. It was intellectual, it was spiritual, it was in my dreams. I was getting dream instructions to return to England to find climate camp, and it was all of these really strange things. And so a lot of it was I had to learn it myself, and that's something as well that, you know, a lot of communities are also displaced from their land and their territory. So often we have to dream the ceremonies again. We have to reconnect with the ancestors. We have to reconnect the wires. So some of it was then also through connecting with the Indigenous Environmental Network when I started doing the tar sands work. And that was where I got my training around how to do nonviolent direct action, but with a spiritual core. Like, I've never been arrested, and I've done some crazy stuff, and that's because the intention was never to be arrested. So, you know, that's often intentional when we do. So again, so through the Indigenous Environmental Network. And then when I'm doing a lot of the campaigning work and a lot of the shareholder activism, often a lot of the care work, like making sure people have eaten, making sure that they're fed, that they feel okay when they're coming from the Arctic and they've never walked on concrete before. A lot of the NGOs and in those spaces, people didn't want to do that work, and they would just put elders in the hotel, and I'd be like, what? This is the work, making sure people visit and they go. And that was sometimes when I would get so many of the teachings and the stories and the understandings around people's life stories, and these, what I would call like walking encyclopedias of that. So and that's why I have this logo that's like a megaphone that's like turned to my ear, and I actually reversed the engineering in a megaphone so that it's a listening device and you can listen through it. And that was to kind of personify some of these feelings. And that also came from my herbalism training. And with herbalism, there's a scientific practice, but also you have a practice where you become a hollow bone, and you become hollow and you become empty so that you can receive the teachings. And that's also very close to phenomenological practice of, you know, letting go of the frameworks that you bring to something so that you can hear. So I find that, you know, with the climate crisis, I consider it creative practice because it's something we've never done before. We've never faced a pandemic and white supremacy and fascism and a climate crisis before. So I find we constantly have to go into that space of unknowing, of collaboration with the ancestors, as well as doing all of the science and the political studying as well.
Thank you. I mean, it's really beautiful how you speak about philosophy and activism and the spiritual all intertwined. And yeah, I think that's also something that's very obviously, of course, missing from a lot of our school and education systems, you know, that we can't speak about, politics, but even more so that the spiritual is not an element of it. And I think that's maybe starting to change, but it seems like a really important thing to start learning how to listen also as teachers. So thank you for that. It's really, I really like that idea of a hollow bone. That's beautiful. And so, so you talked a bit about how you see your creative practice and also working in close consultation with Indigenous people. And I think this word ally is one that comes up a lot in contemporary art and cultural contexts where we're trying to think about solidarity and social and cultural justice. But I think it's something that many of us are still trying to learn how to support a community without speaking for them, listening to them, as you could say. And then there's still a lot of centering around representation, it seems, in contemporary art and film. And do you know of any strategies, or maybe strategies isn't the right word, but approaches where artists and institutions really center the communities who are most effective?
Sorry, it cut out that last little bit.
But yeah, so if you know of any examples or any approaches where artists and institutions center the communities who are most effective in a way, affected in a way that's effective.
I think that's a journey of trying to understand what it takes, and I don't think I haven't experienced that yet, where it's been happened really well, that the cultural institution doesn't just invite the community in, but they make a commitment to also us curators. Like, often I get asked so many times by galleries, like, oh, can you recommend some POCs, or can you, that in itself is consultation work. It takes relationships. And also, I have a responsibility. If I recommend someone, then that person's relationship, I want to see the work all the way through, that they're taken care of. So actually, it's what I've experienced is some organizations get one part right or not the other part right. So yeah, I think it's the way I can speak about it more is in like what I haven't felt yet. And what I haven't felt yet is that we are met as curators as the investment in new works. Like, for instance, the work that I do, so much of it is intuitive, or it's on the ground running, and I need time to transmute that into research, into a work. And so often that it's assumed that I've already made a work, or that I don't make works. So we need to also invest in the investments in the process, in the research and the time. And then the other part is, or asking what's already happening and what do you need. So, if you have a program, and I know that funding and funding restrictions really change that and what you want to ask of people. But sometimes what's needed is like more capacity for digital media creation. It's resources to make banners. It's really tangible things. And so when I went into the art world, sometimes it was literally so I could crank out leaflets at the printer, or use the laser printer to make something new. So really, that's where this power and privilege, and what I call recentering, is recentering art institutions to really understand what is needed before we engage in that. So I think there's been attempts, the Serpentine Galleries had some really interesting conversations. The University of Nottingham Contemporary Arts had a really great exhibition on the rights of nature. But what we need to see more of is more arts residencies for healing, for turning what I said, like experience into understanding it first for ourselves, to be like, whoa, what just happened? How is that an art practice? Translating it into that. Because at the moment, a lot of the art and ecology resources, I see some of the grants and residencies that are available for work that we just do isn't necessarily in our hands. And the other thing would be grant writing. Partner up with someone who you see has praxis, and that's something I'm looking for. I currently don't have any art funding, even though I just made like the Forbes list today, but I don't have any art grant funding. So we're often like, that's the thing, we're hyper visible, we're hyper represented right now because everybody wants to put our faces on everything. But if you look behind it, there's not a lot of resources. And that's why I talk a lot about the difference of representation and diversity. And that's something also for us to ask ourselves as BIPOC, like, what are we actually fighting for? Like, are we putting our faces on this, but are we thinking about the resources as well? So I think at the moment there's just a lot of gaps, but a lot of good intention. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And it sounds like it's also a lot of these things have to do with long-term care, structurally, but also individually, and how to support that. And I think it's something that the arts world, as you say, in the funding world, is not really set up to do, but is really important that we do set up to do. Yeah. So hopefully we grow in that direction.
And I think collaboration is one of the easiest ways to do that, because if you're already an artist and you've got, you know, a line to a funder, if you can enter into a meaningful collaboration and change each other in that, it's also a way to get these resources moving between art and activism as well.
Thank you. And yeah, so you were kind of saying that now is a good time to do research and to maybe also reconnect with the world around us, the natural world, as much as we can. I know that for me, taking walks has been really important in this time. But I wonder if there are also dangers of some climate goals or some ideals being diverted because of the pandemic right now, and attention being taken away even more from marginalized communities. And even though Biden has been elected in the US, you know, fascist agendas still might be on the rise. So yeah, I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that, and maybe if you have some thoughts on how to keep that energy going in the right direction and that focus.
Yeah, I think just on Biden, you know, Biden architected the child camps, and also is extremely dangerous for the Palestinian movement. So I think we haven't really won anything. It was quite painful to actually watch people celebrating that when we think about an international movement and an international context. So I think that's the first thing, is we've got to internationalize. And right now, all of the resources for climate activism are being held in the US, and they're being held in a small group in Europe, and it's not BIPOC. And so why that's happening is because the funding strategies that come down from the funders are things that aren't necessarily what we know is needing to move forward. So the need for critical analysis is really important. And the problem is that if you're critical, like even if you were critical of the Biden win, it was like, oh, you're not capable of joy. And it's like, no, I just also, my heart is breaking for what this means for Palestinian people and what this means for the front line. So the first thing is we need to be able to have critical reflection. And that's why I work as a philosopher as well, is to hold that space. So the first thing would be to, and it's a process of recentering. That's what I think of it as, and I constantly do it myself. When people are critiquing the movement, or they're trying to raise an awareness of a false solution that's like carbon capture storage, that we constantly recenter that, and we hear it and we hold it, and we reorientate the movement towards that. So that's a big part of it. And I think, as you mentioned with coronavirus, maybe in our realities that means hunkering down and restrictions of freedoms. But on many of the front lines, it means now there's increased crises. Now there's climate catastrophes, oil spills, plus coronavirus. At sites of extraction, there's increased sexual violence and corona infections from workers who continue to work in this. So I think, you know, as we're coming in and we're more on our phones, it's like looking at those front lines and paying attention to them. You know, this year there was a massive cyclone in Bangladesh, Bhutan. It impacted 10 million people, and there was not a blip on anyone's radars. So I think, and this might sound, I don't know, a bit esoteric, but when we go to nature, are we coming in like service and coming like I sometimes go to the water and I'm like, yeah, I don't know what to do. What is up? Like, give me some direction. So if we're coming to nature to ask for guidance, to ask for direction, we're not just coming for, we need nourishment, and we need that, but we come in collaboration. Like I just had a dream the other night where there was like a tsunami wave and it was coming over me, and it was like I tried to hold on to this would, and it was that moment where I realized that I was going to drown and other people were already drowning. And I woke up and I was just like, oh my God, there's a tsunami. And in the Philippines, there was another tsunami. And I was like, but what do? I can't, we're going to share this on Twitter until like we have RSI. Like, where is this care? This critical, I call it critical climate care, of this responsiveness to what is already happening. And that ties back to climate literacy. When we think of what is the work of climate literacy, we have to bring this humanitarian aspect back into it, of responding to the people who are already feeling this, who need very tangible things. Often it's like food in a crisis, shelter. So I think why we go to nature, why we're getting it, is really important. And also who has access to even pray in nature. When I was in Amsterdam in the lockdown, my feet didn't touch the ground for months because of being inside, and it was so painful to not have that access to nature. So also thinking about how we even have access to nature for those praxis as well. So it's kind of, I don't know if that answers the question, but it kind of, I think that just think about what you're going for. And if you get nourishment from the plants and the trees, like what are you giving back as well?
Thank you. Yeah, that sounds like a really good way to start, just outside our doorsteps or our windowsills or whatever we have access to. I just wanted to ask if there's anything else you feel would be important to share in this space, maybe something that happened recently.
I think it's really important that, we do all the things, that we do all the research, we understand the science, we understand, all of those things, but we really take that time, like I said, to connect to the empathy and to the care and to the understanding of what is already in play, what is already needing of us. And it doesn't mean that we don't bring, have a healthy relationship with the ego, but watch when we're bringing our ego, and especially with creativity, what do we think of as creativity? It's not always creating something new. For me, being creative means holding my space in the climate movement, continuing to run No Tar Sands, often at times with no resources, in a context where there's often misogyny, sexual abuse, all sorts of abuses. So rethinking at this time what we even mean by creativity, what we even mean by art, and kind of, invoking Joseph Beuys in that sense of like, what is a human being? And so, I would just encourage you to really connect with your own dialogue with that and your dreams with that. Because I think, I wouldn't have done all of these things that I've done without collaborating with unseen forces, with the elements, and sort of decolonizing myself in that sense.
Thank you. That reminds me, I wanted to ask you still about a specific artwork that you were part of. I think that's how we can term it. But at the Somerset House this summer, there was this arrivals and departures board by artists Yara and Davina, and I didn't see it in person because I was in Amsterdam, but it looked really interesting to me as a way of combining creative practice with, I guess, holding space for others. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah, so the idea was to, I did a takeover of the boards, and it was a climate justice takeover. And so I put in some of the names of climate activists that were here, and their arrival date on the earth and the departure date from the earth. And it was such a fascinating process for me to think of, who do I include? Who do I leave out? What is my criteria? And so I really just thought, you know what, I'm going to include people who care about me, who have checked in on me, who haven't just demanded work of me, and who I admire at the moment. So, and then also looking at the ancestors, this was when I started to dig really deep into the Bishnoi history and learned about Amrita Devi, who was in the 1700s in Rajasthan. And so I remember in the morning reading about her and just crying. Like I said before, like I'm like, oh, this is why I'm like this. And so it was really powerful to honor their names, to put their names up there. But it was also such a responsibility of the names that aren't there. Like I've done similar lists with Mothers of Invention at Doc Society, and there's this Forbes list today. And it also made me feel very uncomfortable about who we name, who we don't name, and then all the people who are beside us, like, you know, my partner who cooks for me and makes sure that I can keep doing this work, you know, my sister who prepared the materials for the banners, all these people who are part of this. So I think it was really interesting around naming, the criteria of naming, and also thinking about the Colonial Centre, to put those names in London, where so much of these forces continue. Yeah, and just to invite people to continue that process of working with ancestors, even if you can't intellectually or even philosophically understand it. You know, we're at this point where, yeah, open yourself up to that process and see what happens to sustain you and to hold you through the work.
Thank you. That's such a beautiful note on care to maybe end the conversation with as well. Thank you so much for joining me and for talking about your work, and also for just doing the work that you do. I will continue to follow your work, and I think people can follow you on Twitter and online on all the platforms, and you often share ways of supporting, so I hope people will do that. And yes, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Astrid. It was great to connect with you.